Hi, my name is Carl Valeri, host of Aviation Careers Podcast, and I have a real special guest with us today. You know, during our career coaching sessions, we discuss many options, specific to your needs for building time, but we don't always talk about the safety concerns pilots should have when they're building time. Well, today I'm speaking with Max Trescott, whose Aviation News Talk podcast is focused on aviation safety. By the way, you can find it at aviationnewstalk.com. Welcome to the show, Max. This is awesome to have you back.
Carl, so great to be here.
You know, we were talking before the show that you were actually on, I think, episode 17 back in 2012, and it's so wonderful to things have changed in the industry, but some things haven't.
Yeah, it's great to be back, and you're right. That's the nice thing about safety. It turns out pilots are still killing themselves the same way they always have, so that makes our job a lot easier.
It does. And we're going to talk a little bit about that. But before we get started, just a shout out to the sponsor of this podcast, and that's Stratus Financial. They provide private student lending for pilots. They're pilots out here themselves, and they offer student loans for pilot training from zero to hero. Stratus Financial understands your needs because they are pilots. You can find more at stratus.finance. And as a sponsor of the podcast, Stratus Financial is giving away scholarships guides, and you can get yours for free using the coupon code STRATUS when you visit aviationcareerspodcast.com/free. Whether it's financing your dream of flying or simplifying the process by taking care of your student loans, their efficient, hassle-free funding can connect you to the life of your dreams of becoming a professional pilot sooner than you ever thought possible. To find out more, go to stratus.finance. And again, use that coupon code STRATUS to get that free scholarships guide. Well, let's get on with the show. Max, before we get started, let's talk a little bit about your podcast and your focus on safety, because we're going to talk about building time, but more on the safety aspects. For people that don't know your podcast, tell us just a little bit about it.
Sure. So it's one of the few podcasts that's focused strictly on general aviation, that is Aviation Podcast. A lot of folks talk about airlines, military, things like that. We never talk about that unless it somehow relates to something that could relate to general aviation flying. And the focus is on safety because, frankly, I think that that's one of the most important things. It doesn't help if you're trying to build your 1,500 hours, but you kind of die along the way. And you and I both know lots of people who have passed away, almost all of them in general aviation. And so that's really my mission, is to help people become the safest possible pilot.
So let's talk about that as far as safety and building time, because the majority of these accidents, like you said, happen while they're flying general aviation aircraft while they're building time. So, Max, why is it so important to people who are building time, trying to get hired by the airlines or their dream job? Why is safety so important?
Well, I think it's a little ironic that people probably don't realize that 1,500 hours is probably 100 times more dangerous than, the next 20,000 hours that they're going to have when they're in the airlines. And when I say 100 times more dangerous, it's probably actually worse than that. You and I both know that the current airline safety record is impeccable. It's as close to zero as you can get. And yet we're killing probably 400 people a year in general aviation accidents. So it's really not 100 times more dangerous. It's probably infinitely more dangerous. So I think people just have to be aware that they have to be really careful and safety conscious. And if you look at Dr. Paul Craig's book, The Killing Zone, he says that most of the accidents happen to people who are in the kind of the 50-hour to 250-hour zone. So low-time pilots are at particular risk. And then finally, if you look at the drivers for accidents, a lot of people think that having total time is going to improve your safety record. And yet the accident data shows that what really drives a safety record is not total time, but time in type. And so you really want to be very careful every time you jump into a new aircraft type. You want to get that first 100 hours or so very carefully. And you want to do that really by learning everything you possibly can about that aircraft. And you just really want to stay within safe margins. Don't be doing anything that's at all risky. So you really got to know your airplane extremely well. Knowledge is king.
Interestingly that you said that, because at the airlines, if you talk to pilots and have a very frank conversation, most of them will tell you they don't really feel comfortable till their first 6 months to a year in the aircraft. And that's usually what I give myself. I still consider myself a newbie if I've had 6 months. And 6 months, I mean, you've been flying like 300 to 500 hours in this aircraft. So, I mean, that really correlates. And you find that as you see people move up in their careers to different aircraft, I feel they become more safety conscious. We are going to talk a little bit about that because they understand the risks involved as they've been flying more because of the experiences they've had and the experiences they've had by watching other people have issues during that flying time. But as far as somebody who's looking at building time, I think we at times don't realize that at 250 hours, going back to that, and I remember when I got my commercial rating, I thought I was like the king of the world. I was so happy and I was so excited to get out there. And I got my first job in general aviation, and that was actually being a flight instructor. I mean, I got my CFI shortly after. And there's one thing that I have always taken into consideration is safety. But I found that, I myself have taken certain risks during that period that I would never, ever take right now. So with that said, what are some of the safety-related things that we should be thinking about when we're that new pilot, 250 hours on a job?
I think you're right. I think it's really easy when you've got that commercial ticket, maybe you've got your CFI, you got 250 hours, and you feel like, wow, I really have mastered this. I am a god in aviation. I know everything there is to need to know. Boy, that couldn't be further from the truth. Yet I think about how much I've learned since I got my pilot certificates many, many years ago, and it's order of magnitude what I knew then. So the problem is, when you're at that point in your career, you don't know what you don't know. And so knowledge is really king. You want to learn everything you possibly can. You want to be a sponge. I tell people that no detail is too small. Your goal really is mastery of the aircraft, which means, when you have spare time, be reading through the POH. Take a look at the limitations section. Understand what it is you're allowed to do with the aircraft, what its limitations are, what you can't do. But I think probably the most important thing, and you kind of alluded to this, is bringing a professional attitude to your job. So in other words, maybe you've got 200, 300, 400, 500 hours. You've got a job in general aviation somewhere. You might be a CFI. You might be doing something else. You really want to have the same mindset that you expect that you'll have once you get into your dream job, once you're at the airlines. It's not that different from people in the corporate world who are taught to dress for the next level of management that they hope to be in. It's the same thing. As a pilot, you want to bring the same attitude that you're going to use someday at the airlines. And so what makes the airlines so safe? Part of it is SOPs, standard operating procedures. So you want to be taking a look at those within your GA job as well, and figure out ways to improve them. Take a look at all the policies that they have. Figure out ways to make them better. Be an active part of the safety culture of whatever company that you've joined. So, for example, part of that's identifying hazards. Take a look at the risk. Make sure you report them to management, or if you've got a safety office, report it to the safety office. As you move up to larger and larger companies, they're going to have SMS or safety management systems. Be an active participant in filing reports, for that. And then finally, I think part of the professional attitude is just don't do stupid stuff. I can think of, unfortunately, a retired airline pilot who I knew. I had seen him just a couple of weeks before he died in an accident. He went flying along in his Cessna 140 really low, and he hit some wires. And unfortunately, he had his 18-year-old granddaughter along with him. And I talked to someone who'd been in college with him, some 40 years before, and her comment was, he always liked chasing cows. Now, that's one of the dumbest ways I can think of to die. Yeah, it may seem cool to get down there close to the earth, but use that professional attitude. Would you be doing that in your airline job? Heck no. So don't be doing it when you're in some other job.
I think sometimes we do. We disconnect when we get into a general aviation airplane. Sometimes we either relax too much. We take a different attitude. And if we bring those same attitudes to general aviation aircraft, I think we wouldn't see as many accidents. But also, going back to what we were talking about with the 250-hour pilot, I know that I thought I was safe and I thought I was being safe, but I didn't know what I didn't know, like you said. But I didn't at the time, I think, understand, or I wasn't able to identify some of those hazards. So maybe we could do that today. Maybe, we could define some of those hazards if someone's here listening that has those 250 hours, 500 hours, and they're just getting into general aviation for the first time.
Sure. I think one of the biggest hazards that pilots are not aware of is night flying. And it's kind of unfortunate that there's the old joke about, night flying is no different than day because the airplane doesn't know that it's dark. That's kind of silly, and it really dismisses the serious dangers we have at night. The fatal accident rate is double at night what it is in the daytime for all kinds of obvious reasons. And then you've got some illusions that trick the human body that you might not have in the daytime. So, for example, one I think that all pilots should be aware of, and if when you hear this word you're not familiar with it, I urge you to go and do lots of research, and that's cinematographic illusion. So, big fancy word, but what it really means is that when the human body is accelerated, we perceive that we're pitching up. It kind of feels like our head is tilting back. We interpret that as a climb. And if it's night, for example, and you're taking off and you're accelerating, it's going to feel like you're climbing. And yet you need to cross-check the instruments. You need to make sure that you're at your VY airspeed. You need to make sure that you've got a positive rate of climb, because if you just kind of feel like, oh yeah, it feels like I'm climbing, you may be crashing within the next mile. Most of those accidents at night occur, within the first mile, and often it's the case that they're taking off over water, for example. So you're down in Florida, you're near the coast. So friends of mine took off from Key West at night. Boom, it's pitch black immediately after they take off. So cinematographic illusion is something that really traps people. It can also occur during a missed approach. So, for example, if you were, accelerating level, in the clouds, it's going to feel like you're pitching up. And oddly, Southwest just had an incident very much like that a couple of months ago in Hawaii, where during the missed approach, they were accelerating straight and level. They gained something like 60 knots straight and level in the mist, and then started pitching down. So those pilots must have felt cinematographic illusion. They must have felt like, oh, we're climbing. In fact, we're climbing at such a high rate that we need to be pushing down. And they got within 400 feet of the water. And then, of course, there was the tragic Atlas Air accident down in Houston, in which the first officer accidentally pushed the go-around switch. The aircraft started to accelerate. And the NTSB said that the amount of pitch up that they would have experienced would have felt like the aircraft was pitched up 80 degrees. And so what happened? They ended up pushing forward. They were coming out of the clouds at a 45-degree angle. So cinematographic illusion is something that people really need to understand.
I'm glad you mentioned that, because it happens to all of us. I mean, even people that are very experienced, I've had it happen to me. And the solution to that is to look at your instruments and trust your instruments. And that's something that's hard for us to do sometimes. But if with a lot of practice and discipline, I think we can actually make ourselves much safer. And I think you go back to that, you should always try to master your aircraft, like you were saying before. Get out there and do some very low visibility takeoffs, with a flight instructor, under the hood, that type of thing. Experience that right after takeoff, because that gets a lot of people, like you said. And I actually really enjoy watching that when I'm teaching at the airlines, because we do some 0-0 almost, or 666 type of takeoffs, 600-foot takeoffs. I mean, visibility, gosh, and it's amazing to watch people at first when they first do it. And some people are right on if they've had some training, and some people it doesn't work out so well. Let's put it that way. But it's better to do that in the simulator. It's better to do that with an instructor than to do it in real life, because it can have some tragic results, like we talked about.
Indeed. Well, let me mention a couple of other things related to it. So, for example, black hole approaches, and I think a lot of people go, oh, yeah, black hole, I understand, I know what that is. Well, you might not. There's just a lot of subtlety to it. And the issue, again, it's one of human perception. They've done simulator studies, Boeing did this back in the 1960s, in which they put ATP pilots in the simulator and they had them fly over a black surface with no lights, and they all crashed. And they went back and they explained to them, this is what's going on. And they put them back in the simulator. And again, all but one of those people crashed again. So just understanding what black hole is isn't sufficient for avoiding it. The issue is that when people have no lights below them, no references, they tend to fly so that the runway in their eye appears to be about the same size, about the same angle. And for that runway to stay the same size, you have to follow a curved path, which takes you to a point, into the land, into the terrain before you reach the runway. So in that particular case, you gotta back it up with a glide slope, either a visual glide slope, a VASI, or with some type of electronic guidance, for an ILS or something like that. So I think those two illusions are probably the two biggest things that really trap people at night. But then there are lots of other kinds of things. So, for example, the NTSB says that loss of control is probably the number one type of accident that occurs. And some of the factors they mention that are pilot proficiency, stalls, distractions. I don't know about you, but I've found that many of the incidents that I've had in an aircraft are due to distractions. It's so easy to be chatting away with your passenger and just not be aware of things. So I think that people really need to understand that the whole concept of sterile cockpit, yeah, it's important. It really is important. Don't be up there having so much fun that you're, chatty Cathy, talking away and not paying attention to things, because that can lead to loss of control. And then lots of traffic pattern accidents. I would say a high percentage of accidents are in the traffic pattern, many of them on the base to final turn. So as pilots, as CFIs, I think we really need to, have our sensors on high. We need to really be paying a lot of attention. I've talked about a number of accidents recently where the pilot just got slow on base and stalled. Airspeed is life. You gotta watch the airspeed. So yeah, if you're up there in cruise, yeah, sure, fine, you can relax a little bit. But boy, during takeoff and during landing, I am on high alert. And the airspeed is, part of my scan. I'm looking at that probably every couple of seconds. And then other, biggies, I think, circle to land. The number of circle to land accidents is just astounding. I think instrument pilots really underrate how dangerous circle to land accidents can be. So there was a study out of Europe, and they basically said that circle to land accident rate was 25 times higher than the accident rate for flying on a precision approach like an ILS. So you think of most things and you go, well, it's 50% more dangerous, or it's twice as dangerous. Well, 25 times more dangerous. Wow. If you think about that, suppose you flew an instrument approach every other week for an entire year. You had 25 ILSs, and then you did one circle to land for that last landing at Christmas. The amount of risk that you had in that last approach is equal to the entire risk you had for the 25 other approaches throughout the year. So I really avoid circle to land, whenever possible. And people just don't understand that when you're doing a circle to land, often pilots will have a downwind that's too close to the runway, which means then when they go to turn base to final, the base is too short, and then they overshoot the final. So circle to land is just fraught with difficulties. I would rather land with a tailwind than have to do a circle to land.
And with that said, I know people are going to write in and say, "Hey, listen, it's the only way I can get into my airport." And I get it, but if you're somebody who really is concerned about safety, and I would say be very careful. When you do choose to do a circle to land, and it's a lot. It is a challenge. I have to say, going towards that is watching people do visual approaches, especially at the airlines. Things come really unglued very quickly, especially when I'm doing training and saying, hey, just land on that runway. And it's a lot more difficult than you think because we're not used to it. We're used to doing straight, approaches and that type of thing. So if you haven't been practicing it, if you haven't been doing circle to lands, especially to a specific airport, don't. And not only that, there's a reason that most airlines don't do circle to land, right? Because of that fact. Because first of all, we can't get certified. Most of the airlines are not certified in their training to do circle to land because of the visual effects in the simulator. Won't allow it, and if they do, they haven't had a good safety record doing this. So they said, okay, forget it. We're going to put that limitation on there. But there are airports where you have to do a visual type of an approach, but the actual requirements, many times you can't fly in there when it's dark, and there's some really, really big restrictions on whether you can circle to land.
Yeah, and I think those are cases where you really have to look at it carefully and go, does it make sense to just divert and go someplace that's safer? For example, I did that with a Vision Jet trip last year. We were headed into an airport where, because of the winds, we would have to do a circle to land because the only approach was going to come from the other direction. So we diverted to Las Vegas. It's like, well, why fly into this little airport in a valley at night when we have to circle to land when we've got this great, big, huge, safe airport right next to us? So there are always alternatives. You don't always have to land at where you plan to go. I tell folks that our goal when we fly is to not land at our destination. Our goal when we fly is to land somewhere safely. Doesn't matter where, right? But we just have to go there safely. But you and I were talking a little bit before about fatigue, and I think that's one of the huge risk factors that pilots have. Oh, yeah. And again, I think when people are young, and certainly I felt this way when I was young. Hey, I'm Superman. I didn't need any sleep. I could do everything, on a few hours of sleep. And yet what we all learned, if you really study fatigue, is actually if you've got less than, I think it's 6 hours of sleep, your ability is comparable to someone who is, 0.08 drunk. Mm-hmm. And people just don't think about it. Oh, yeah, I'm tired. Well, guess what? You're so tired, you're performing poorly. And like a drunk, you don't even know that you're performing poorly. So I know fatigue has been a huge emphasis at the airlines, and there are all kinds of tools that they use. I mean, tell us about that a little bit.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's interesting because of those tools they use at the airlines, we don't see as many issues. And the great thing about it, we call it the F word, it's the fatigue word, is that we can always call them fatigued. I have to say one kudos is to the regulations that allows us to do that, right? This new FAR 117. But the biggest thing is to understand when you are fatigued or that someone's telling you you're fatigued. And if you do have that instance, then it's time to actually stop and say, I'm done. The one, I have to say, one good thing about the airlines compared to being a flight instructor is that you're still going to get paid, right? And I think that's the pressure on somebody who's a CFI, is that if I call them fatigued or I am fatigued, I'm not going to get paid for that flight. Whereas an airline pilot, you're going to get paid for that. It is where it's difficult. Here's a scenario where an airline pilot has difficulty a lot of times. Say it's Christmas Eve. And you have a plane load of passengers and they need to get home and you have been up for 24 hours and you just can't stay awake. And I know this because it's happened to me. And I was in the cockpit and I was getting ready for a flight to leave. And I'm on the phone with dispatch. And the next thing I hear is, sir, are you still there? Well, it turns out the first officer was sitting there telling me I had fallen asleep on the phone with the dispatcher. And that was a sign that I was too fatigued to go fly. And I won't get into why I was up for 24 hours, but it had to do with the scheduling that they did with the airline, that I personally did not have that rest. Rest rules have changed, so you don't see this happening as much, but you do have to catch that. The great thing about the fatigue is that we have reporting and we measure it so that we know how to build schedules better. But we will not fly fatigued. I mean, that is a huge thing. But sometimes you don't know. You get these micro sleeps and things like that, and you have to kind of nudge the person. Another thing that helps us, amazingly enough, with fatigue is flight attendants. They're told to give us a call every hour, say, hey, are you guys, do you need anything? Part of that is to make sure that we're awake and we're not overly fatigued, that type of thing. Obviously, when you're in flight, you can't do a lot about it unless you really do need to divert, which doesn't happen very often, that's for sure. But using those same rules for fatigue, the I am safe checklist and things like that. So, get used to using some of those tools that they have at the FAA, and we still use them at the airlines, amazingly enough, just like you do, right, with all your general aviation flying, right, Max?
Yeah, indeed. And you and I have talked about a book that you and I both have.
Yes.
Talk about that for a moment, because I think that's such a valuable resource.
So I'll talk about it since I'm actually done with the book. I know, Max, you're reading it right now. It's Why We Sleep. What a terrific resource. I'll be honest with you, I'm one of those people that have always said I don't need sleep, so this is something that I wish I never had to sleep. I've always said that. And it drives my wife nuts, because if I could stay up 24 hours a day, I would. I would do things like this and read and stuff like that. And I used to be able to push myself. I used to work 36 hours in a row, and that's not good for you. And I found that as I got older, I've noticed that I started forgetting things, et cetera. And I was like, you know what? There's something's wrong here. I'll get up at 3 a.m, do work on the computer, et cetera. And it turns out that it was my sleep deprivation that was causing me to have, diminished responses and the inability to remember. And through this book, Why We Sleep, I learned also there's some tools to help yourself sleep better, but also make you realize that, you need sleep. And I have fought this all my life, wishing that I didn't have to have sleep. And you learn things like caffeine and sleeping pills and other tools that we use, melatonin. There's things that really we may be misusing, which that was a big thing for me as I round up realizing that we were I was misusing caffeine. So that has actually helped me. The ability to sleep better has changed my job. I mean, it's so much better. I won't, like when I go to California a lot, I love hanging out in LA, but now, you know what? I go to bed. I force myself to go to sleep. I can see whatever it is next time I go there. And that's a tough decision. I mean, because you battle that in your mind. But even if you're younger, it does diminish your abilities. And I know, Max, I'm sure you've been in a career where you've not slept much. But this one that we have with aviation, the consequences are more dramatic than, say, falling asleep in front of the computer.
I like the way how you put that, because I did have a career, as you did, prior to aviation. I was in high tech, worked for 25 years at Hewlett-Packard. And sure, I burned the midnight oil all the time, burned the candle at both ends. Sleep for me was never a priority. I was always a night owl. I would stay up to all kinds of hours. There was always things that my active mind was thinking about, and I had the same attitude towards sleep as you do. One of the things I think that really helps put it in perspective is, not only is it good to get sleep because it makes you better at your job, better judgment, less accident prone, but you're going to live longer as well. And I don't think people realize that. People who get good sleep live longer than people who, burn the midnight oil and don't get good sleep. And if that's not a motivating factor for you, I don't know what else would be.
And proper sleep is important here. It's not just the amount, it's the times and that type of thing. There was some studies done about working night shift, and that may reduce the amount of years that you live, and it's been proven. So it's some of those things that you want to look at, and that might be a choice in what you do in your job. And some people are night owls, and some people are larks. So you find those things out. So that is really, I tell you, I highly recommend this book, Why We Sleep, and I'll put a link in the show notes so that people can find that. But Max, you'll, I'm sure, review it when you actually get done with it.
Yeah, indeed. And I want to mention just a couple of other hazards as well. And I'm glad we spent so much time on fatigue, because I think it's totally underrated and it's so incredibly important. But in terms of other hazards that people face, here's one that was kind of surprising to me. The NTSB, or maybe the FAA, one or the other, did a study of accidents, fatal accidents, over some period of time. It was like 15 years or so. And here's the surprising thing they found out. 30% of all fatal accidents involve a violation of an FAR. So you wouldn't think that breaking the rules would be that dangerous, and yet it really is. And so people need to understand, especially if they've got kind of an anti-authority bent, oh, those rules don't apply to me, oh, I'm smart enough to be able to get around this, that's just for people who aren't really great pilots like I am. And by the way, I think that if we were to survey pilots, that we would find that, their skills, about 95% of them are above average, right?
Right.
yeah, exactly. So
we always estimate higher.
Yeah, indeed. So for me, I make following the FAR a game. I do everything I possibly can to never, ever violate a single FAR, even if it's inconvenient for me, because I know I'm putting myself on the correct side of that risk. The people that are breaking the rules, hey, sometimes they're killing themselves. Not all the time, but some of the time. And there was another interesting study, and I think this came out of the FAA's medical group. They looked at accidents, and they looked at the different kinds of medications and drugs and things that people were on. And if you look at the fatal accidents, around 10% of fatal accidents involve some type of illegal drug or drug that used to be illegal but isn't anymore. And another 20%, and I think this is shocking to people, involve over-the-counter types of medications that are banned by the FAA. And so the FAA has a no-go meds list, and I would say most pilots are completely unaware of it. And let me just give you an example. People may have allergies, they take antihistamines, and there's, for example, I'll just go ahead and mention Zyrtec, for example. People use Zyrtec, and yet if you look at the FAA's no-go list, you need to wait 5 times the dosage period before you fly after you've taken that medication. Now, if you take the 24-hour version, that means you got to wait 5 days before you're allowed to fly again. And I think this is something that people just don't understand, is that just because it's not a prescription medication, if you think, oh, I bought it over the counter, it's fine. No, actually, there are probably a couple of dozen of these common everyday medications that you can't fly with. You have to wait for some period of time afterwards.
Absolutely. It's something that I think that we don't realize. And medications, also alcohol, you're at those things. I mean, even if it's just a couple of drinks that you have, all those things affect you and affect people differently, by the way, and I found that out too. So medication is very, very important to look at if it's going to affect you and how it's going to affect you. Very good point there. Another thing that I think has been really important in keeping safe is realizing that as a CFI, I know when I became a CFI, all of a sudden here I'm the person in the cockpit, and I'm now the one responsible for their safety. What could I do wrong? Well, that's kind of it is a hazardous attitude. But what you have to realize is there are a lot of hazards in being a CFI, and the majority of people that I know that have lost their lives building hours have been CFIs or been involved in instructional flight. So, Max, maybe you could point out some of the different hazards that are out there as far as in safety issues, as far as CFIs are concerned, and how to avoid those.
Yeah, the good news is that flight training has an accident rate that's 1/3 of the personal flying rate. And so you're less likely when you have 2 pilots or even a student pilot in the airplane to have an accident, because there are now 2 of you that want to come home and have dinner that night. Single pilot flying, a lot more dangerous. So training as a CFI can be safe, but I think there are a number of little gotchas to look out for. I would say one of the big ones would be to look out for what I would call crappy airplanes and crappy management. If you're flying 50-year-old airplanes, yeah, that might be okay, but you really want to take a hard look at the maintenance. Are you confident as you interact with the maintenance people that they're doing what they need to do all the time? Are the squawks getting taken care of relatively quickly, or are they lingering for week after week after week? Those, I think, are some potential red flags. And then in terms of management, it really makes sense to see, are they concerned about safety? Now, and I'll pick on airlines, every airline says, safety is our number one job. It's like, well, no, actually, profit is our number one job, because if we don't make any money, then we go out of business and we can't be safe. So yes, safety should be very high on the list. And yes, everybody does have to make money in their business. But I would be looking at flight schools where, oh my gosh, they're cutting corners, and hey, they're trying to ask us to do things that are, cause us to be fatigued, or cause us to cut corners. Watch out for those kinds of places. And then in twin engine aircraft, if you're a twin instructor, the thing that I worry most about is the VMC demos. It seems every year we have, I would say, at least 3 of these accidents. And not only does it kill the instructor, a future airline pilot, but kills the person in the left seat as well. So we're killing 2, future airline pilots when we do that. So I would be extremely cautious when doing the VMC demos. Make sure that you're guarding the controls. Make sure you've learned everything you possibly can learn about how to make this a safe type of procedure. And then in terms of guarding the controls, I actually did an episode with John Fiskus, who's a high-time flight instructor, episode 334, and it was called Making Flight Training Safer. And John has a great analytical approach to things. He said that it really bothered him that people would always give coaching to a CFI or even a student pilot, and it was like, well, add a little bit more power, or do a little bit more of this. And it was not very quantitative. And so what John came up with was kind of a quantitative approach to flying safely in the traffic pattern, by basically looking at the standards in the ACS and then applying them to each of the different legs of the pattern. And he's pretty much come up with a formula for when he's going to jump in and take over control of the aircraft based on how well the student is performing at that particular point in time. Obviously, the closer you get to the ground, the more risk you're at. And so, CFIs really need to know when to jump in. And if you're just starting as a CFI, it might not be so obvious. But there are times you will have to take control of the aircraft.
Absolutely. And the one outcome you don't want to have is an accident or incident, and that's something moving forward in your career. I teach at the airlines in the simulator, and sometimes the great thing about that is I can crash and no one's going to get hurt. And I tell you what, if I have had that where someone would be arguing with me that this is the way they want to do it, I'll say, okay, it's yours. And sure enough, we'll crash. And boy, that the rest of their career, they remember that. I wish we could do that in general aviation. More of that in general aviation, where we can demonstrate that. Wow, I just killed myself without getting killed. And that's something that I think is very important. Like you said, is to have those limits, because there are no real do-overs when you're out there in the actual airplane, like there are in the simulator. And that's something that I think that we at times, I think we drift. And I'll let you make it a point here, is we drift away from being as safe as we could, because we wind up saving the student many times and think that it's a hazardous attitude that we can save the student anytime, and that's not always true. What do you think of that point?
Yeah, and I think you're absolutely spot on about simulators. And I also agree that it makes sense to allow pilots to kind of go deeper, into their mistakes, because they're really going to remember it afterwards. For example, I was doing transition training into the Diamond DA-42, and I had a multi-engine certificate for a while. Instructor was checking me out in this particular aircraft. At that particular point in time, and this was 15, 20 years ago, I hadn't been doing a lot of work with retractable aircraft, and I forgot to put the gear down. And did he on downwind say, "Hey, Max, you forgot the gear"? No. Did he mention it on base? No, he didn't. When did he do it? As we were coming down in the flare, he says, "Gear is up, go around." Scared the living heck out of me. And you know what? That moment was more memorable for me as a pilot than if the flight instructor had saved me from that. So I try to let people get a little bit deep into things, because I recognize that if it scares the heck out of you, you're definitely going to remember it. And then in the simulator, I was training a number of people who were low-time pilots working for a local survey type company. So they're flying all around the country doing mapping kinds of things. And I would have them do the standard instrument departure off of Palo Alto, which includes climb to 3,000, expect 5,000 within 5 minutes. And I would forget to climb them. And so about 6 or 7 or 8 minutes later, they would kill themselves on the side of a mountain. Mm-hmm. And one of them said to me, well, I was always taught to trust the controllers. They're there to keep us safe. And hopefully he learned the lesson. When the controller makes a mistake, the pilot dies. So you really have to always be, watching yourself, because everybody makes mistakes. All pilots, no matter how good we are, we make mistakes. Controllers make mistakes as well.
Absolutely. What an incredible point that was made there. And specifically in certain countries, as you go throughout your career, I mean, you basically will get whatever you ask for. As you ask, hey, I want to fly through that mountain, they'll say, sure, go right ahead. Because the captain's authority, right? And the captain is like a god in certain countries, which you realize you're not. And that's really, I love that point that you made there. I'm interested to know, Max, since I've been out of a lot of general aviation training in a small environment. I've worked with bigger schools and all, and the bigger schools tend to use those simulators to go over this type of training. Have you seen in the GA market? I'm curious if you know this, that even smaller schools are going towards the simulator flying, or is that not part of their curriculum usually?
So the club that I fly with is fairly large. We've got about 50 airplanes, 40 instructors, 1,000 members. So I don't have a lot of exposure to really small flight schools. I have worked at smaller clubs in the past, and it's not atypical for them to have one simulator. So I would say it's probably a little bit more common. They get used mostly for instrument training. The one area where I can see that they can be helpful for private pilot training is just procedures. It's not like you need the view out the window, but it's just a great way to kind of drill, hey, when you do a go around, these are all the steps that you follow. And I know you see this in the airlines as well. Go arounds are just fraught with problems because you do them for real so rarely, and there's just a number of different steps that you need to get done in the right order.
Yeah, absolutely. And, one of the things and the reason I wanted to lead into this is that another way to keep ourselves safe is simulators are so inexpensive nowadays. You can get one on your laptop. Maybe go over, even if you're an independent instructor, you can sit with somebody and say, hey, these are the procedures for this. Obviously, you can do some instrument flying, but it really does help, especially on the go-arounds. And that is, I'm so glad you brought that up, because it's the one thing that we tend to really mess up. And one of the tools that I use now, someone taught me this, is always brief the go around. As you're flying, okay, this is what we're going to do. We're going to call out these certain things for the specific airplane we're flying, and we're going to do this, fly this heading or whatever it may be, but say it out loud. And it really works. I mean, saying it out loud. So I've been using that tool quite a bit.
I love your comment about saying things out loud. One of the things that I've started doing when I started flying in Cirrus aircraft was the pre-departure briefing. What are we going to do if something happens on the runway? What are we going to do at 500 feet? What are we going to do at 1,000 feet? And I think there's something about the way the human body works where if we speak aloud about what our plan is, it's just more likely to happen.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Max, these are some great tools and all, and there's a great discussion here. And I know we were originally going to talk a lot about different time building ideas and some cautions here. And I know we're kind of coming up to the end here. Maybe we'll have you back on just to talk about those specific things. But I think it's most important to talk about the safety items and how to keep yourself safe while you're building hours. Moving on to the airlines, because if you have an accident, incident, even if it doesn't kill you, it could stop you from getting to the airlines or hinder your process on the way there. But can we leave with a couple of tools possibly as far as risk management is concerned? Maybe there's something we could leave the general aviation instructor. What can they use, the independent instructor, to mitigate risk?
Boy, I think risk management is probably the most important skill that any pilot can have. So if you're going to focus on ways to improve your piloting skills, you definitely want to become an expert in risk management or a student of risk management. Because I think so many pilots work themselves into a situation where they just shouldn't be there. So for example, this week I'm talking in episode 342 about a Cirrus pilot who flew from New Jersey to Bar Harbor. And when he got there at Bar Harbor, the approach was near minimums. But not only that, the weather was widespread low ceilings across most of the states. Virtually all the airports had low ceilings. And so the question in my mind is, why did he even bother taking off? Because if you get to the first airport and have to go missed and all the others are equally bad, where are you going to go? So in that case, if he had decided to go anyway, I think it would have made sense to divert to some airport where the weather was better before he even got to the destination. But I think from a risk management standpoint, one of the charts that I've seen that I think makes a lot of sense for people to think about is kind of the difference, the correlation between the probability of an accident and the consequences of an accident. So, for example, if you were to draw a graph along the bottom, the x-axis, you could draw low to high probability. And then on the y-axis, as you go up, go from low to high consequences. And one of the areas that I think that pilots really underrate or underestimate is those low probability, high consequence kinds of accidents. So a key area I think would be propeller safety. I think people realize, the odds of a pilot coming in contact with a moving propeller are extremely low. And so it's easy to get kind of complacent about that. When things don't happen frequently, it's kind of easy to dismiss them and go, oh yeah, that'll never happen to me. And yet for these low probability, high consequence type accidents, if it does happen, that 1 in 10,000 time or whatever, it's going to be catastrophic. People who have contact with moving propellers, they lose limbs, or they die. Or it might not be the pilot. It might be the passenger who doesn't have the same knowledge and the same orientation that the pilot has. So I would say people should be thinking about risk in terms of, what is the likelihood of this happening and what is the consequence if it does happen. And, don't dismiss these low probability, high consequence type accidents. And then I think for folks who are looking at building time and they're in some of these general aviation jobs, here's probably the most important thing to remember. No job is worth dying for. Yes, you may need the hours, but you got to survive. And so if you see the little red flags, if you can kind of see the handwriting on the wall, you're desperate for the hours. But, if it looks risky, get the heck out of there. Just quit. Go find another job. Find a different company with management that's got a better safety orientation, that's flying better maintained airplanes. Think about yourself first. You have to survive that 1,500 hours. And if you find yourself in a situation, where it looks like there's some issue there, do something about it. And then I just want to kind of mention in terms of building time, we did a couple of episodes on Aviation News Talk a couple of months ago, episodes 323 and 324, where I talked with Rob Mark, who's a friend of mine, former senior editor in Flying Magazine. Rob has had more jobs in aviation than anybody I have ever met. And he's worked as a controller, he's worked as an airline pilot, he's worked in all kinds of GA jobs. So we talked about 13 different ways to build time. So I would encourage people that if you're looking to build time, go check out episodes 323 and 324.
Absolutely. Max, has been awesome talking about this. But most importantly, I think after we've talked about trying to stay safe while we're building time, I would encourage people to take action and try to think in their mind, today, what could I do? Just pick out one thing I could do to make myself safer as a pilot and to keep myself safe, to get to those 1,500 hours, to get to the airlines that have all those safety standards. But you know what? If you keep doing that and keep trying to make yourself safer, you're going to be a safer pilot for the rest of your career. And I think that's very helpful. But Max, boy, this has been awesome. Just a great discussion. I'm glad you brought this up. We'd love to have you back on, maybe even talk about some of those ideas as far as building time.
That'll be great. Thanks so much for having me on the show. It's a pleasure to see you again.
Yeah, and Max, before you go, tell us, just so people know, your podcast, and again, what they'll expect when they get to that podcast.
Oh, sure. So Aviation News Talk is focused on general aviation and focused on safety. And our mission really is to help pilots become the safest possible pilot they can. So check it out at aviationnewstalk.com or, wherever you get your podcasts.
Awesome. Again, thanks, Max, for being here. And thank you for listening or watching on YouTube. We actually are going to have a upcoming coaching mastermind group, and that's going to be August 14th. We have one every month, and we put this together because people were having a tough time getting into my coaching schedule, but we talk about things like this, keeping yourself safe. We do inspirational stories. I do my industry update. That's where I actually spoke with Max a while ago. I actually shared in the public, which I normally don't do. I only do during my coaching sessions, what I felt the future is going to bring. I spend hours and hours analyzing, hours of talking from CEOs and try to figure out what that means for your career going forward. And that's what I talk about in the coaching session. Plus, we have a specific topic, and then we have other people ask questions. It's very inexpensive. But it's only $20 a month. But you can get one for free, 1 month free, if you use that coupon code CoachIt4. Just go to aviationcareerspodcast.com/coaching and use the coupon code CoachIt4. I really appreciate everything Max has done for aviation safety, and I appreciate what everybody else out there has done for aviation safety and producing podcasts, keeping it top of mind. But I think the most important thing that you can do for me is that to promote that safety, do something every single day to actually make you a safer pilot. Do something today to move forward in your career. Do something today to make yourself safer. But the most important thing is to take that one step, and take that one step now. Take that today. Take action now. Take one step today to move forward in your career and also add to your safety in flying. Do that today for me. And we'll talk to you next episode. Safe flying out there.